Welcome back, all of you, dear viewers. Dr. Anand Kulkarni and, of course, Professor Ghanashyam Borate. I welcome all of you in this new episode of Great Talks with Dr. Anand Kulkarni. In last few episodes, we tried to understand concepts related to the contemporary criticism, or what generally called as the postmodern criticism, especially focusing on post-structuralism, deconstruction, and of course, post-colonialism. Now we move further, and now in the coming sessions, including this one, we will try to focus on the recent trends in literary theory and, of course, criticism. So, in today's episode, we will take up cultural studies, which is a very hot selling cake nowadays, a very hot topic, a buzzword, you may say. And of course, it is though very famous, it still has got a lot of problems of understanding because this field is relatively new. A lot of material is available, but most of the time the problem is that because so much material is available, the students and researchers find it extremely difficult to chef it out. What exactly is to be read, where to start, what should be the starting points. And nowadays you will find that cultural studies is frequently prescribed at different examinations like national eligibility test or even other entrance tests at PhD and other courses. So students face great problems in actually comprehending this entire issue of cultural studies. So to begin with, sir, in today's episode, I would put this question before you, that how exactly we should understand this term called as cultural studies, because there is another term called as culture studies. So we generally often confuse ourselves with these two terms, cultural studies and culture studies. So how this should be understood, this term should be understood to begin with.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Pranav Ratnaparki and Professor Ghanashyam Borate, and very good morning to all viewers. Today, we shall discuss uh, the notion culture studies and its history in brief. Dr. Pranav rightly pointed out the confusion that culture studies, both as a field of inquiry and its similarity with culture studies creates. It is important to know the difference between cultural studies and culture studies. To begin with, we can say that culture studies has been there for quite a long time. When we refer to the term culture studies, we mean to say that we study culture and we study it from conventional point of view or traditional point of view. Whereas when we refer to the term cultural studies, we study from recent available theoretical discourses. So the major difference between the two is that culture studies concentrates on or considers culture as its focal point, keeps culture at its center, and tries to understand many different practices, many different fields from culture point of view. Whereas cultural studies does not bother much about the culture proper, the conventional traditional culture, and brings into so many different and diverse discourses to examine and investigate the present living conditions from social, political, cultural, geographical point of view. So, culture study is limited, conventional, restricted to culture, is more concerned with the cultural parameters. It is normative and notional, and it is disciplinary also. Whereas cultural studies is the exact opposite of this. It is not conventional, it is not notional, it is not normative, it is not intellectual, it is not disciplinary. And to add to that, it is reactionary also, because it reacts against the established norms, the given parameters. So that, I think, is the difference between cultural studies and culture studies.
Right.
While culture studies focuses mostly on culture, cultural studies uh, considers culture from very many different angles like political, social, geographical, sociological, Marxist, psychoanalytic, post-colonial, new historicist, and even many other critical approaches available these days at our disposal.
Right.
I think this is enough to differentiate between
Yeah.
culture studies and culture study
Right.
to begin with.
So then we say that this is a recent phenomena. We call it as a recent phenomena that started coming around maybe in the last few decades. But this entire issue of looking at culture from a different perspective. So how can we trace the background of this cultural studies? From where exactly, from which point it started, this entire issue of culture?
Fine. That takes us to the history of culture studies.
Hmm.
Let me tell you at the very beginning that there are certain precautions that we have to take when we are dealing with culture studies. First is that culture studies is not an academic discipline. It is against discipline. It is against any academic inquiry. It is against any kind of institutionalization. In other words, it is against any established pattern of understanding. And that I think makes culture studies more difficult to understand and more difficult to practice also. At the same time, there is not an exclusively specified methodology. There is not a set of norms, set of theories, set of approaches, a frame of analysis or frames of analysis which are available, which we can very easily uh, follow and make the examination possible or make the analysis possible. So, because of the variedness and the complexity of culture studies as a field of inquiry, perhaps makes it very difficult for students and teachers and researchers and practitioners also. So, this heterogeneous nature of culture studies is something that we have to keep in mind when we are discussing or when we are trying to understand culture studies. As I said, it is against any kind of historical, moral, sociological account because it is not descriptive, because it is analytical, and because it is multivalent and multidisciplinary. Uh, Still, I think for our convenience, because Stuart Hall, perhaps the most pronounced and
Yeah.
most articulate uh, practitioner and theorist of culture studies, warned the students and teachers and practitioners and researchers of cultural studies to stay away from these kinds of uh, simplistic exercises or simplistic gestures towards knowing cultural studies. Keeping this caution at the back of our mind, but for the sake of our convenience, we shall move back to the origins of culture studies.
Right.
We shall see that culture studies has its origins as an academic practice, has its origins in England, and it started somewhere in the 1960s.
Hmm.
And it was primarily an initiative, an intellectual kind of enterprise taken by the adult educators. They were primarily the adult educators. That is, the teachers who were teaching the adult people. There was adult education, and they were involved into adult education in England. The first and very important figure who made cultural studies come on the ground and become an important field of inquiry was Richard Hogarth, a British adult educator. He was probably responsible for the rise of culture studies as a field of inquiry. As I earlier said, Richard Hogarth was an adult educator, but more interested in mass culture and more interested in bringing mass culture to the forefront because all practitioners of culture studies were not the part of the mainstream university education.
Okay.
they were not the part of mainstream education. They were outside the mainstream academic world, and because they were concerned with the masses, education of the adults, they were closely associated with the large section of the society which was probably undermined, underestimated, and marginalized by the mainstream education system. Richard Hogarth, as I said, was the pioneer from this point of view. He wrote a very wonderful book by the title "The Uses of Literacy," in which he tried to emphasize the significance of the importance of uh, mass education against the class education. It all begins with that. And he established a forum, or what you call the Center for Cultural Studies, Birmingham Center for
Birmingham.
Cultural Studies, which became an important and pioneering institution, and which provided the necessary impetus to the cultural studies. Followed by Richard Hogarth, there is another very important figure called P. Thompson. Thompson was more of a social worker, a public intellectual, and less of an academician. So he emphasized, he insisted on the social side of the culture studies. He was more concerned with the social uplift, the social betterment, and all those things which were very important those days. So that I think we have to understand. Thompson he came from the working class background, and he was more concerned with, interested in the working class society, and he thought that working class or working classes can contribute a lot towards the development of society. Thompson can be seen as a link between the first generation cultural critics like Richard Hogarth, and the second generation critics like Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall.
Yeah.
It was Raymond Williams, who was largely responsible for the theoretical establishment of culture studies as a field of inquiry. If you ask me who is the most prominent academician who dealt with non-academic issues also, and gave the necessary status to cultural studies as a field of inquiry, it was Mr. Raymond Williams. We all know he later on became the professor and probably the most important British Marxist critic. That is another link that we have to understand, because cultural studies has very close associations with Marxist literary criticism or Marxist worldview. All these have been the devoted Marxist critics: Richard Hogarth, P. Thompson, Raymond Williams, and Stuart Hall. All of them, though a few of them were not the actual party workers, they were not the member of Marxist Communist Party in England. Raymond Williams was not, Stuart Hall was not. But then they were committed Marxists. Raymond Williams was a committed Marxist. He was perhaps the first important Marxist British critic who brought Marxist ideas to English society and pronounced them and explained them. And one part of that was, of course, cultural studies. We know that he proposed his notion called, his theory called cultural materialism.
Yeah.
And it was through this cultural materialism that Raymond Williams tried to analyze society, politics, culture, literature, and everything. And Raymond Williams, for the first time, brought literature into the consideration of, or into the parlor of discussion of politics and culture. Because earlier we know that literature was studied in isolation, and it was supposed to be an exclusive right of the elitist people. Raymond Williams, for the first time, made it a mass activity, brought it into the into the public sphere, public circle, and tried to interpret from not just Marxist point of view, but from the cultural point of view. Another thing that Raymond Williams did was that he distinguished between high culture and low culture, and that he came out with three kinds of. He wrote a wonderful book by the title Culture and Society, which I think should be considered as the pioneering work as far as culture studies is concerned. This Culture and Society, the book that he wrote, in which he distinguished between high culture and low culture, and he also explained the three important classes of three important categories of culture, in which there is dominant culture, there is prevalent culture, and there is an emerging culture. In which he was of course on the side of the emerging culture, that is low culture, mass culture, that is what we call it, or popular culture, we may also call it to be a popular culture. So he was perhaps the first important cultural critic in that sense of the term, a theorist who could neatly and very rigorously distinguished between the earlier conception of culture and the conception of culture that he wanted to advocate. From Raymond Williams, we move to the last and very important theorist as far as cultural studies is concerned, and it is Stuart Hall. We know that Hall was a Marxist, an avowed and declared Marxist, but at the same time, he was a very great practitioner as far as cultural studies is concerned. He was invited to Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies by Richard Hogarth himself. That was in 1964. And it was in 1968 that he became the director of the Center for Cultural Studies. And from there on, you have a very strong flow of the inquiries which were carried out not just by Stuart Hall, but those who joined Stuart Hall later on. So we can consider Stuart Hall to be the father of culture studies, if you ask me. If Raymond Williams is the father of British Marxist criticism, we can adequately and comfortably claim Stuart Hall to be the father of culture studies, especially the British cultural studies. And these cultural studies were later on developed into different nationalities and different cultures, like American culture studies, Australian culture studies, Canadian culture studies, and then Asian culture studies, which we nowadays call them to be post-colonial studies. But this is a rough idea, how culture studies developed over a long period of time, roughly 60 to 70 years, because that started somewhere around 1957, 58, and now we are in 2020. So I think that covers roughly 70, 80 years of period. It is in that sense we can say that it is a recent phenomenon, a recent field of inquiry which has been initiated and has been variously practiced in different cultures and different nationalities across the world.
Right.
But I think there is another thing that we have to understand. If you have anything else to ask in between, I shall stop and then we shall continue.
No, sir, just I wish to ask that your entire argument probably tries to say that these people problematized culture, or they started looking at culture from a different perspective. So that perspective, which is probably very different, rather contradictory to some of the considerations that went before them, like Arnold, for example, who talked about high culture and low culture and these things. So my question is that what was the necessity in a way to problematize culture? So the overall argument is that culture is not a very a pure thing. Culture is not a very sacred thing. Culture is not something that is static, but it also has got a lot of ramifications related to politics, or maybe to sociology, or to anthropology, or of course to economics also. So why this entire idea of problematizing culture came up during these 60s and 70s? That was a kind of brief kind of question which I would like to put.
Okay, fine. That is also a very wonderful way of looking at it. Fine then, it starts with Maternal. You rightly pointed out that it was Maternal who I think was the real troublemaker as far as the considerations about
Culture.
culture is concerned.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of considerations about culture, but it was Maternal, the Victorian poet and critic, who was largely responsible for the establishment of notional establishment of or normative prevalence of culture, uh, in his times. Now, what made Arnold so much aware of, so much conscious of culture, where the contemporary period, the contemporary time in which he was living, his contemporary time, of course, because Arnold found that the culture he was living in was a hybridized, corrupted culture, a culture which he did not desire, which he did not favor. He wanted to replace this culture with high culture. The reasons were obvious. Arnold was living in the world which was industrialized. That was one very important thing. And we all know that Arnold was on the side of poetry, on the side of
Yeah.
art, and he always disliked science, especially the industrialization that science had brought in. And he thought that science was corrupting the moral, the cultural tastes and behavior of
Yeah.
the society in which he was living.
So this was
So,
during
and
19th
again,
century.
yeah, and again, we know that he wanted poetry to replace religion to counter science. This is another thing that we have to understand why he looked upon poetry to take the place of religion and to fight against the advances made by science. One of the important advances, according to Arnold, was industrialization, and it was not just important, it was having a corrupt influence over the society. So he wanted to remove this corruption from society, and he wanted to reset the cultural standards which he thought were there in the classical period or in the period uh, preceding to his time.
Hmm.
That was the concern that he had. Industrialization was a major concern for him. The emerging working class was another concern because the emerging working class was being paid, and working class men used to have a lot of money available to them, and they could purchase so many things. And Arnold thought that because of the availability of money in terms of currency and exchange was making them morally corrupt and very passionate. So, emergence of working class, industrialization, and advances of science were some of the evils, according to Arnold, which were responsible for the corruption of culture. That was why he wrote a very
Yeah.
phenomenal book, a very seminal book by the title Culture and Anarchy, that was in 1869, in which, the very title itself is very self-explanatory. It explains culture and anarchy in contradiction with each other. Culture, according to him, is something which ensures the moral and appropriate behavior of the society. Anarchy is something which allows immoral behavior which is unacceptable as far as the set standards are concerned. So he contradicted culture and anarchy, and of course insisted that culture should prevail and not anarchy should prevail. In his time, he found that it was anarchy that was let loose, that was prevailed, and anarchy should have been eliminated, should have been removed with the help of culture. That is why he came out with the culture concept of high culture. Again,
Yeah.
his concept of culture was divided between the two. One was internal culture, another was external culture. That is in culture and anarchy, that he elaborated. External culture is the culture which is corrupt. Internal culture is the culture that he favored, which according to him was pure, uncorrupted, simple, and standard.
Hmm.
So this internal culture was the culture which was concerned with the evolution of inner self. He was more concerned with the evolution of inner self, the development of inner self. And he found that the external culture was creating bad influences over the culture in which he was living. If those influences were to be removed, there was a necessity of the evolution of development of the inner self. And he found that the present day, that is his present day society, was not allowing the development of inner self. Naturally, he disliked and very strongly criticized the mass culture. Now we come to a very clear cut understanding of the division that he made between mass culture and class culture.
Thank you, Dr. Kulkarni, for giving us a very succinct outline of the critics and their contribution, and especially how the culture, the concept of culture, underwent a change from, let us say, the mid of 19th century to the mid of 20th century. Within those 100 years, how the culture, the very concept, underwent a change. So I thank you for enlightening us on these issues in the first episode of cultural studies, which we are covering under recent trends as far as literary theory is concerned. I thank Professor Ghanashyam Burate for his active participation, and I expect the endorsement from the audience by subscribing our channel and continuing to watch more episodes, exciting episodes of Crit Talks with Dr. Anand Kulkarni. Thank you.